Well, for more on that, as well as the U.S. China trade dispute, I'm joined by Brai Odion-Esene, founder of SW4 Insights, a public policy advisory firm. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So obviously, starting with this latest escalation, now we see Mexico coming into the eyes of the Trump administration. What are your thoughts on how tariffs are being used as a tool in this?
Well, this is part of the course of this administration, where they use the U.S. economic power to force action on a separate issue. And so I think there's been long declared frustration within the Trump administration with how much or how little Mexico is doing to stem the tide of immigrants crossing over the Mexican border into the U.S. And so I think Trump and his inner circle view this as one way to force action on the part of the Mexican government. And
we've certainly seen that same tactic applied to China. We know that this started off as a trade deficit issue and then suddenly became conflated with things like Huawei, 5G technology, and now national security as well. How would you characterize where trade negotiations stand now between the US and China?
Well, they're definitely stalled, as we've seen, and that's what led to the increased tensions, shall we say. I don't believe that necessarily back-channel conversations happening right now, but we both know that come June, both President Xi and Donald Trump will be at the G20 leaders meeting, and I do think it would be poor planning and, dare I say, irresponsible for there to be some talks before then to at least lay the groundwork for the two leaders will discuss when they meet.
So when they do meet in Japan for the G20, what are the expectations going into that?
I think the best case scenario would be another cease in hostilities and bringing both sides back to the table, as happened last year in November when they met in Argentina. So I don't think we can expect the two of them to come out holding hands, holding an agreement high. But I do think, given the relationship they both have, and a face-to-face conversation might at least, cool things down and again lay the groundwork for conversations down the line.
And speaking of cooling things down, let's talk about how we got to this point of this sudden ramping up. It seemed about less than a month ago things seemed to be on track, progressing towards a deal. In your opinion, what fundamentally changed between then and where we are now?
Well, I do think that a lot of the things that the US was pushing for, especially around IP protection, ending forced tech transfers, fair market access, these things are not solved overnight. And so to expect that 6 months of talks would be enough to address what, in many ways, very systemic, fundamental issues, is not possible. Because what we have here are two countries that have been trading partners for a long time. It's only natural that at some point there will be a rebooting of that relationship. But again, that doesn't happen overnight. I think both sides went in perhaps with lower expectations than they should have had, and that once the talks broke down, we are where we are now.
And as the talks broke down, the tariffs continued to go up, and now there's also reports that China is stopping its purchases of U.S. soybeans, and now also this issue of the rare earths, these essential minerals being used in almost all electronics, also potentially being banned. A huge exporter China is to the U.S. Do you expect things to get worse before they get better?
Well, it would be very devastating for economies if things got worse, right? Like the way the economy works now, there's too much interconnection, too much global supply chain reliance for either side to come out of this unscathed. So I think odds are cooler heads will prevail, but there will be a lot of saber rattling on both sides, hence the rare minerals threat, Trump saying earlier that he might impose tariffs on all Chinese imports. But I do think there's no one wins in that scenario. Not businesses, not consumers on either side. And China has a good surplus with the US, but the US has a services surplus with China. So there are easy ways where both governments could hurt each other. And I think they realize that, and odds are they will not get to the brink of going full on.
And people are certainly saying that it really is the consumers who are the biggest losers in all this. When can we expect the effects of this ramping up of rhetoric and tariffs to really start hitting consumers in both countries?
Well, so far, the tariffs that the US has imposed on Chinese imports have been on capital goods, which don't really translate as quickly into increased tariffs on consumers. Now, if Trump were to follow through on his threat to impose tariffs on everything that from China that comes into the country, then you're seeing not just capital goods being hit, but consumer goods like cell phones, etc. And then the consumer feels it more directly. Currently, there will be increased prices from the tariffs, but it will not be overnight. It'll be a more gradual process because a lot of companies, a lot of businesses have tried to get creative with trying to deal with the tariffs, either moving their supply chains from China to Vietnam, the Philippines, India, etc., or not passing the costs onto the consumer. On the flip side, recent data from retailers, etc., has shown that US consumer demand is quite weak right now. So if you're a businessman and you're smart, you can't necessarily pass on high costs right away to a consumer that's not demanding your goods. But eventually, that cannot be avoided.
And obviously businesses have to take a much longer term view than consumers. So are most businesses already planning their strategies for this long term discussions, as we're seeing the trade dispute isn't ending anytime soon, or are some of them taking a wait and see approach?
Well, I think this is a case in point for why businesses should never treat public policy as an afterthought. Because too many times we've seen businesses only wait until something bad happens or until a bad policy like this one is enacted, and then they're scrambling to figure out how to react to it. And so being forewarned is forearmed, as they say. I think right now a lot of folks are learning that and adjusting in results. So again, whether it's moving your supply chain somewhere else, or finding new suppliers, or passing the cost on to consumers, or just, like you said, waiting and seeing because they can't afford to move anywhere else, and so they're stuck.
Certainly lots to keep an eye on. Thank you, as always, for your insights. Brai Odion-Esene, founder of SW4 Insights.